Thanks for joining us. This is Omni View episode 87. It's June 19th, 2026. And as always, we're covering what happened from every angle. Here's the news, the perspectives, and the questions worth asking. Afghanistan strikes inside Pakistan have broken a fragile border ceasefire, raising risks of wider regional fighting that could draw in outside powers. Afghan forces carried out strikes on sites inside Pakistan. The action follows earlier clashes and directly threatens an existing ceasefire between the two countries. Al Jazeera reports that Afghan authorities describe the strikes as necessary self-defense against cross-border threats. Pakistani officials view the same actions as unjustified violations of sovereignty that require a firm response. Deutsche Welle notes that both governments previously agreed to de-escalation steps, yet continue to accuse the other of harboring militants. Afghan leaders maintain that sustained pressure on militant sanctuaries is the only approach that has prevented attacks on their population after repeated rounds of restraint failed. Pakistani officials counter that cross-border military responses create a precedent that can quickly spiral into open conflict and close off negotiated border management. Each side concedes that civilian casualties and refugee flows have accompanied past fighting. What evidence would show whether the strikes targeted active militant positions or broader infrastructure? Shifting now to legislation under consideration in Central Europe. The Czech cabinet approved a bill that would replace the existing license fee system for public broadcasters with direct state funding and greater political oversight of appointments. Deutsche Welle reports that supporters say the change modernizes financing and reduces the burden on households. Critics inside and outside Parliament warn that removing independent revenue streams hands future governments direct leverage over newsrooms. Government backers maintain that license fees have become outdated in a digital environment, and that parliamentary accountability for public media spending is a basic democratic safeguard. Opponents, including journalists and opposition parties, argue that stable arm's-length funding has been the main barrier preventing ruling coalitions from shaping coverage, and that the bill removes that barrier without creating new protections. How do other European countries fund public broadcasters without direct government control? Turning to North American security concerns. Canadian police report that gun murders have increased nearly 90% over the past decade, with the large majority of recovered crime guns traced to sources in the United States. France 24 notes that Canadian officials and police unions call for tighter border inspections and stronger U.S. export controls. U.S. gun rights organizations argue that criminals will always find ways around legal restrictions and that Canada's problem is primarily domestic enforcement. Canadian authorities point to seizure data showing that most traced firearms cross the border illegally and contend that coordinated tracing and export licensing have reduced similar flows elsewhere. U.S. advocates respond that focusing on the supply side ignores repeat offenders inside Canada and that additional paperwork at the border would mainly affect lawful owners without stopping determined smugglers. What percentage of seized guns in Canada have been successfully traced to specific U.S. purchases? Next, we look at telecommunications expansion in South Asia. India's largest telecom company announced it will develop its own low Earth orbit satellite constellation, while SpaceX's Starlink service still awaits final regulatory approval. CNBC reports that Jio executives framed the move as a way to extend broadband to remote areas without waiting for foreign operators. Regulators have so far kept Starlink on hold, pending spectrum and security reviews. Company statements emphasize that domestic infrastructure keeps data routing and control inside India and speeds deployment in underserved regions. Regulators and security agencies argue that any satellite operator must meet the same licensing standards applied to terrestrial networks, including data localization rules before service can begin. How long has Starlink's application been under review in India? Moving to energy procurement in Southern Africa, the trading firm Vitol secured exclusive pipeline access to supply diesel to Zambia through September under an emergency deal that the International Monetary Fund has urged the government to end. Bloomberg reports that Zambian officials cite urgent shortages that required quick procurement. The IMF has flagged the arrangement as lacking competitive bidding and transparency. Government statements stress that fuel shortages threaten power generation and transport, and that Vidal's existing infrastructure allowed deliveries to begin immediately. IMF staff maintain that bypassing open tenders raises costs and reduces accountability, especially in a country already under an IMF-supported program that requires stronger public financial management. When did Zambia last conduct a competitive tender for fuel imports? Shifting to Southern Europe, where tourism policy is under review, the newly elected mayor of Venice said he wants to increase the existing entrance fee for day visitors during peak periods to as much as €50 to reduce overcrowding. The Guardian reports that city officials argue the higher charge will manage visitor numbers without harming residents. Tourism businesses warn that large increases could simply shift crowds to nearby towns rather than reduce overall pressure. The mayor's office points to data showing that day trippers contribute little to local services, yet add heavily to congestion on bridges and public transport. Hotel and restaurant associations respond that predictable pricing and advanced booking systems have worked better in other historic cities, and that sudden jumps risk damaging the city's reputation with repeat visitors. Which other Italian cities have tested similar visitor charges? A state-funded redevelopment of the St. Kilda Pier in Melbourne received the Victorian Architecture Medal for its community-focused design. State government officials and the architects note that the project added improved public access along with new safety features. Some local residents have questioned whether the overall cost justified the alterations to a familiar landmark. Award judges praised the redesign for balancing recreational use, environmental resilience, and space for civic gatherings. Critics of the budget contend that targeted maintenance on the original structure could have met similar safety goals at lower expense while retaining more of the pier's historic character. The Guardian covered both the award decision and the differing views on the project's scope. Now to energy markets, where prices moved after diplomatic news. Oil prices dropped after news that planned U.S.-Iran discussions would not proceed as scheduled, and tanker traffic through the Strait of Hormuz returned to normal levels. CNBC reports that traders cite reduced immediate supply concerns. Analysts focused on longer-term demand note that OPEC output decisions will now weigh more heavily on prices. Market participants argue that restored shipping routes and the absence of new disruptions have removed the risk premium that had supported prices above $80. Other observers point out that seasonal demand patterns and OPEC plus compliance rates remain the dominant factors, and that any renewed diplomatic setback could quickly reverse the decline. How have prices reacted to previous postponements of U.S.-Iran contacts? The technology site Wired published updated recommendations comparing Apple's current Air, Pro, and Mini tablets on performance, display quality, and price. Reviewers note that most users do not require the highest priced model for everyday tasks. Power users and professionals are directed toward the Pro because of its display and processor advantages. The guide states that the Air model provides the best overall balance for media consumption and note-taking. It adds that the Pro's higher refresh rate and extra ports justify the added cost only for those editing video or running demanding applications. Wired also compares battery performance and accessory compatibility across the lineup. Italy's Il Cinema Ritrovato Festival opened its 40th edition with screenings of restored films dating back more than a century in outdoor venues across Bologna. Organizers described the event as an increasing draw for younger viewers interested in film history. Streaming platforms have begun licensing some of the restored titles featured at the festival. Festival programmers argue that public screenings of archival prints create a shared cultural experience that cannot be replicated at home. Streaming executives respond that wider digital availability has introduced these films to audiences who would never attend a festival, expanding rather than replacing traditional exhibition. The Guardian reported on the programming choices and recent attendance growth. In a new interview, Katy Perry described struggling with her mental health during her separation from Orlando Bloom and called her recent relationship with Justin Trudeau a positive development. Perry presented the separation period as the most difficult of her life, yet said she is now in a better place. Tabloid coverage has centered on the high-profile nature of both relationships. Perry's account stresses personal growth and the value of support networks during public breakups. Media outlets covering celebrity relationships often highlight the contrast between private difficulties and public image, noting that such disclosures can affect fan perceptions and future projects. The Daily Mail summarized the interview content and the online discussion it generated. Now, to really understand the Czech media funding debate, most coverage treats the license fee as a simple budget line. Yet the real mechanism is the legal firewall that keeps day-to-day editorial decisions away from the finance ministry and the ruling coalition. In practice, an independent board appointed for fixed terms and protected from arbitrary dismissal collects the fee through a separate public corporation. That corporation then sets program priorities without submitting scripts or coverage plans for government approval. When the fee is replaced by direct appropriations, the same parliament that votes the budget also gains leverage over senior appointments and can threaten future funding during disputes over specific stories. Next time you see a headline about reforming public broadcasting, ask who appoints the board, how long their terms are, and whether the budget can be altered mid-year without new legislation. Tomorrow, watch for further reactions from Pakistani officials on the Afghan strikes and any movement on the Czech media bill in Parliament. That wraps up today's Omni View. Remember, the best informed people read more than one perspective. If this show helps you do that, share it with someone who values fair coverage. See you tomorrow, and before you go, this show is part of the NARA Network, a family of daily podcasts covering tech, science, markets, and more. If you enjoyed today's episode, give Models and Agents for Beginners a listen. Artificial intelligence explained simply for beginners and curious teens. You can explore the whole lineup at neuranetwork.com. This episode used AI voice synthesis of my voice. Editorial selection and analysis are my own.